So I'm Dr. Anna Arteaga Biggs. I'm a licensed clinical and consulting psychologist in San Diego, California. And I attended the PGSP Stanford PsyD Consortium from 2008 until 2014.
I'm Danielle Levy. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in Menlo Park. I'm a graduate of the PhD program.
And I'm Yvette. I am a psychological assistant at the California Psychology Center, and I went to PGSP as you were leaving, Anna, in 2014. And hi, Dr. Munoz.
Hello, Yvette. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I didn't have anything like this when I was, at any of my grad programs. So I was excited to participate, but I also, we each get sort of 10 minutes. And at the time I was thinking 10 minutes, it's a long time for people to have to listen to what I have to say. Then I sort of realized it's also pretty short because so much has happened, right? To sort of get us all to these places. And so I was kind of trying to think about what I would maybe want to hear, what would have been helpful for me, what I would have wanted and needed as a Latina in graduate school. And I think that it didn't seem like it would be very interesting for me to sort of list off all the different sort of accolades or things that I accomplished, all the different things that I'd done, so much as kind of acknowledging the harder moments maybe that were highly growth promoting for me, but also in some cases a bit shame inducing and painful. So I'm kind of just going to try to show up today, just sort of radically authentic as possible, hoping that that's what's helpful for people. And hopefully between Danielle and Yvette, the difference in all of our presentations will feel like you get what you need today, what you get out of this. So briefly, and also can somebody just, if I have about like 2 minutes left, can somebody warn me? Okay, just so that I don't babble on, because I know we have a time limit. So I was born in Argentina, and my family immigrated to San Diego when I was just a baby. I was only 4 months old. The goal was a brief adventure. I was supposed to only be here 10 years, and then we were supposed to move back. But my parents decided to stay. And I think, people's immigration stories are so important because every story is so different. And there's often this like general portrayal of how things are for everyone. And we all really have different stories. So mine is very different, I think, than what's often portrayed and or actually, experienced. I had this dichotomy of being, very privileged in many ways. I was, I had very healthy, able-bodied parents. We had help available with my grandparents that were here. My parents were able to speak English really well. Well, my mom was. My dad learned, but I had parents that were, pretty educated, but at the same time, we were, eligible for welfare, which my parents said we didn't accept, but that therefore means that we had the privilege of not having to accept that. So I sort of lived in this world where my parents probably were pretty financially constrained and stressed, but I wasn't necessarily privy to that. And so I think that that's sort of important as I do my work here as a Latina, and just all the different people that I've been exposed to in my work that have had obviously very different circumstances than I have. So I also grew up living in both countries. Argentina is very much a huge part of my life and my identity, but it's complicated for me because I exist in this place of having two worlds where neither really truly accepts me, or I don't quite fit in either one perfectly in any way. And so when I'm there, I feel like, yeah, I'm at home, but they're sort of like, oh, you're so American. Or they'll make fun of, like, if I have an accent when I say something in Spanish, or if I say something wrong grammatically. And then here in California or in the United States, I get all the, well, where are you from kind of comments, or the other, all the things that so many of us have had to navigate, right, as people of color. I grew up in San Diego in a very white, very middle-class suburban neighborhood. I was often one of very few brown-skinned people in my class or in my friend group. And it was when I was about 16 years old that I decided I wanted to be a psychologist, which stemmed from somebody very close to me attempting suicide in a very lethal way and thankfully survived it. That actually got me into my own therapy, which then helped me recognize that this was something that I thought I would be good at and wanted to do. So I went on to attend the University of San Francisco, and I majored in psychology, of course. And with the exception of statistics, I really loved it and felt like I was certain that this was, my calling. It was either that or stand-up comedy. And needless to say, my family and everyone is very grateful that I went the psychology route, especially the student loan lenders. They're quite happy that I went this route as well. After undergrad, I took a year to work in the field before kind of going on to grad school, and I did in-home case management services here in San Diego. And then I was accepted to Pepperdine's master's program in clinical psychology in Malibu. And as one might guess, I don't know if this has changed, I hope it has, but at the time I was the only Latina and the only immigrant or native Spanish speaker in my cohort. I believe there were only 4 people of color in my class, and throughout my 2 years there, I only had one professor of color who was a Black female professor and no other professors of color. So that is all, of course, relevant to sort of like how my journey has continued. Of course, I graduated Pepperdine, and then I went to PGSP Stanford's ID Consortium. That was in 2008. Again, I was the only Latina in my cohort. The only immigrant, the only native Spanish speaker in my cohort. And again, not at the time, I had one Black professor and one Asian professor in all of my years studying there. And all of my supervisors were white. Of course, this wasn't the case for everybody, but this was just my own personal experience. So of course, I deeply hope that this has since changed, and I think that it has, which is great. I think that, my time in the consortium was full of peaks and valleys. So overall, I think that I received just an outstanding education. I think I was trained clinically so well on my practicum sites. Everything in that regard was just phenomenal. I felt very prepared to go on to internship. And I ended up landing at Advocate Illinois Masonic Medical Center, which was in Chicago. I froze to death for about 9 of 12 months. But also, I think my time in Chicago was kind of my first real exposure to within our field, like toxic systems sort of within our field, and sort of recognizing that our field isn't as healthy as I thought it was. And I just think that this is something that's not often really talked about in our field. And I think our students aren't prepared to navigate this. So, we as psychologists really help people heal from a lot of these toxic systems and institutions, but then we often are leading perpetrators of a lot of these things. And so I think when you're experiencing that and you're young and you're in training, you can often feel a bit gaslighted because you feel like maybe you're the problem, and maybe you are in many ways, and you are doing things that are problematic, but also there's a lot of stuff happening and a lot of situational forces that if you're not privy to those things, then you have a hard time sort of healing from them or navigating them. And I think that students of color in particular really are prone to sort of being like victims of some of these things that happen. And I know for me, that certainly was the case, both at internship and fellowship. And those were some pretty brutal awakenings for me, to be honest. I feel like overall I had some supervisors that held me accountable in this very compassionate way, who recognized sort of all the situational factors at play. But then I also had supervisors who were very sort of shame-inducing, and that did not really help me to grow or to heal or to, learn in any sort of meaningful way. So all of these things have really influenced me. And I think one of the sort of main things that I wanted to leave, students with today was the importance of breaks, like taking a break. And that's something I think I've learned to do pretty well through this process. Because, we go with school and internship and fellowship, and it's, and then licensure, and it's just so much, and you hardly get a chance to come up for air. So there are three very specific moments kind of in my career that I utilized breaks to really kind of heal and regroup. So I highly recommend that. One was before applying to internship. So I was, on that go path. And then I decided, let me just wait a year and apply then. And I'm so happy I did that. It was the best thing I think I ever did for myself. The other was after completing fellowship before applying for licensure. I just took some time. And then the third was recently after having my second baby, and I just needed some time to recover. So those are all kind of moments that I've just said, I just need some time for me before moving on. And I think that that's so important in our field to be able to recognize that and hold space for that, for our patients, right? And to be able to acknowledge the importance of healing and that a break is not a bad thing and that you will be able to move forward. I think especially when you're in a program where it's like, now you have this, then you have this, and you have to finish that. If there's anyone that's listening today or in the future listening to this that's contemplating that but worried about it, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to share more about that decision process for me. And then basically after taking that kind of break after fellowship, which by the way, I went to Harbor UCLA Medical Center and I did behavioral medicine. So I worked a lot with moms and women in general with various different sort of gynecological diseases and things. And I've been in private practice now since 2016 here in San Diego, and overall I love it. I also do consulting work on the side, which has been a fabulous way to, earn some more money without that burnout that can sometimes happen with the clinical work. And I specialize in grief and loss, anxiety and depression. I work a lot with women in particular who suffer from chronic medical conditions. I work a lot with moms and dads that are, postpartum. I work with former members of cults, so people who are victims of mind control. That's another area of expertise for me. Don't get too many calls around that, but occasionally I do. And then on the side, I just really love speaking on panels and doing things like this. I love mentoring students, and I welcome, I don't know how long I've been talking, so I hope this wasn't too short, but I think that was mainly what I had to share for today. And I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you might have.
What a lovely way to get started. Anna, that was like an awesome setup for this, right? It's like, I'm here to provide kind of like the counterpoint to Anna's like laser sharp focus on psychology and really knowing what she wanted and where she wanted to get. So I also, well, as you guys will see, I'm coming from a very tortuous path to get to psychology. And along that path, I was a management consultant. And I've never done a presentation where I haven't had a presentation, meaning a PowerPoint. So you guys will suffer with my PowerPoint as I walk you through all of this. So, and this is for me, is just kind of like a guide. I put my timer in here too, so I know how long I'm talking about. All right, so Nick asked us to talk about life after PAU. That's the title of the panel today. So I thought I would start with life before PAU, right? Where am I coming from? So the accent's Portuguese. So my claim to, being in the Latinx panel is I'm Brazilian. So I'm born and raised in Brazil. And I'm 100% Brazilian. It's like, grew up speaking Portuguese. I got an accent, like my cultural roots and everything is Latin America. It's Brazilian. I come here to the US and I'm less Latino than everybody else because I'm white, right? So that is a really like odd intersection to be in. Also, because Brazil speak Portuguese, there's also this, I don't belong because I don't speak Spanish, right? I'm not Chicana, I'm not like Hispanic. But anywho, the reason I look this way, my mom is Brazilian, my dad's French, has the little French flag there. I was born and raised in Brazil. I moved to Venezuela after college, and that's where I learned Spanish and lived there for several years before moving to the United States to come here for grad school. So that's where I've been country-wise. But then in terms of how I got here educationally, I've been always interested in a number of different things. So my undergrad is in chemical engineering. I knew I loved analysis, structure. I loved chemistry. I particularly like organic chemistry, making things explode and change colors. So ended up going to the University of São Paulo, Universidade de São Paulo, and I got a degree in chemical engineering. My first job out of college was working for Procter & Gamble, selling baby diapers in Latin America. I worked for their Latin American headquarters in Venezuela, and did that for a few years before I decided that I wanted to get a master's degree in business. So I was lucky enough to get an opportunity to go to Stanford for business school, which I did. Ended up getting a job in management consulting for a few years, and then in technology for 15 years after that. So I was in the web 1.0. Well, many of you were kind of like in elementary school, working in tech here in the Valley. And that was really fulfilling and amazing in many ways, but really left me lacking in other ways. And at some point, and I normally say that's 1 hour and 1 beer, I decided to switch careers and look for something that just brought more meaning, fulfillment, connection in my life, and decided to try out maybe psychology. I had an interest in psychology when I decided to do engineering in undergrad. So I'm like, well, let me see if I still like psychology, and if I like it, I will stick with it. If I don't like it, I can always go back and get myself another high-tech marketing job. Turns out I actually liked it. So I stuck with it and did the, I joined PGSP at the time and graduated from Palo Alto University. And I was in the first class that they had with Stanford Medicine, the Center for Neuroscience in Women's Health, as a specialty track. But throughout my 5 years at PAU, I had an opportunity to get super amazing clinical training. Starting with the Gronowski Clinic, which should also have been here on this slide. I had Frances Liley. I don't know if you guys any of you have met her, but Dr. Liley was this amazing supervisor at the Gronowski Clinic, and really got me interested and excited about building a career connecting with people coming from a very different field, right? Coming from business and stepping into psychology for the first time. But after the Gronowski, I trained at the VA. I think that's where I got introduced to evidence-based care. I had only been familiar with like psychodynamic therapy up to that point. So it was really like a pivotal moment in my training when I was like, oh, there's also structuring therapy. Look at that, right? It's coming from somebody who appreciates that so much. I really, the whole CBT world, of the evidence-based world, really spoke to me. My second year in practicum was the Asian Americans for Community Involvement in San Jose. I know they still have a really strong relationship with PAU. And that's the first time that I did therapy in Spanish, right? And mind you, this is sort of like my third language, so it was pretty, scary, but I did it and really opened up a whole different world of ways that I could contribute and connect with people. I did my internship at San Jose State University. I think that people come to PAU at different stages in their lives. At this point, I had 2 kids already and a husband and a house, and had been living in Silicon Valley for 20 years. So SJSU for me was my number one choice. It allowed me to work with new populations, to be on a college campus, and it was an APA internship within driving distance to my house. So I just want to put it out there that, as we navigate career choices, there are many things that go into decisions that will have big repercussions for where you end up long term. I also tried to do as much research as I could. Aline Barrera was one of my advisors and probably one of the first people that I connected with in her Mamas y Bebés research project. I did research at Stanford as part of the clinical neuroscience in women's health. I did research at the Palo Alto VA. And for me, that was a way to discover, right, new interventions, new clinical areas. And I think that good schooling is a necessary condition to be a good clinician, but absolutely not sufficient, right? If you want to be a good clinician, you got to get good clinical training. And I also believe, as a hiring manager later in my career, I say this often, that you should know how to intervene, for psychological issues from a very broad array of angles, but it really benefits you to have a theoretical home that you can go back to, that you can build upon. So for me, that theoretical home, or my clinical home, became Team CBT. That's something that I got involved with during internship. I was somewhat less than satisfied with the clinical training that I was getting during my internship. So I kind of took matters into my own hands, enrolled in this course that Jill Levitt, a Team CBT clinician, was offering at that time on, some certain set of CBT skills, and ended up really loving it and getting more and more involved in the team world. It's developed by David Burns. He has a number of certification levels, and over the years I have got to a level 5 certification. That's a master's clinician certification. My claim to fame is that I'm actually in his latest book in the acknowledgements page. So I'm like, I've arrived. But that's what I do clinically. My postdoc work was at San Mateo Medical Center. That's the public hospital here in San Mateo County. I started there as a postdoc, was hired as a clinician at La Clínica Latina, doing most of their Spanish-speaking work. Eventually was asked to step in and run the department. So I spent the last 7 years working for San Mateo Medical Center as chief of integrated behavioral health. Working again with the disadvantaged population. At least half of our patient base was Spanish speaking, but really doing work that just feels good for the soul, right? It's just helping people, connecting with folks in need at a very different level. But also I think with one thing that psychology has afforded me that, business career wouldn't have is this tremendous amount of variety in what I do. Several years ago, I got involved with the board of trustees of Palo Alto University, where I had the joy of working with Maureen and Dan and all the other trustees in the governance of the university. I'm currently vice chair of the board and chair of the innovation committee. I have not always, but I have for several years run a small private practice, even as I was working in public health. I have taught psychology. I have done, volunteer or pro bono asylum evaluations, and all of that kind of keeps me engaged and entertained in my work that I do with psychology. And then finally, and I think I'm right on time here, is that my career mostly needs to fit my life. So when I started in psychology, as I said, I had children. I had small children, so all of this journey was occurring as my kids were growing up. And now I have 2 teenagers. Don't wish that on anybody, but it happens. So I have had to adapt, my choices to where my family is. So out of all the things, that I have had on my plate here and there, I'm currently doing private practice. A trustee. I volunteer in my kids' school. I teach at Stanford with David Burns, but I have had to make tough choices to actually be able to fit these people into my life. And, and I don't really know what's next. It's one of those things when you go interview for a job, well, where do you want to be 5 years from now? And I still don't know. But I do know it's going to be exciting. And I think that's one of the cool things that a career in psychology has afforded me. So that's me in 10 minutes.
So this is me when I was a little kid, purple on purple. So a little bit about my story. I was born in California. My parents are from El Salvador. So I lived there for a year when I was in kindergarten. I would spend my summers there. So felt like a second home, which I think Anna, you mentioned that was your same feeling as well. I grew up in Sonoma. I had OCD as a kid when I was in middle school. So my mom thankfully sought out a psychiatrist and I started therapy. And that really put me in a place to be able to flourish later on. And I think that planted a seed of this was something that I was wanting to do. And then in high school, I volunteered at Wilmar Center for Bereaved Children. And I really saw the power of having people that we can lean on, and the power for the kids to be able to lean on one another. I went to the JC for a semester, I went to SF State, and I volunteered at Clínica Martín Barrow, which is in San Francisco. It was founded by Felix Curi and some of his students. It's a free primary healthcare clinic that serves Latinos who are slipping through the cracks and don't get the healthcare services that they need. So that was pretty pivotal. That's me on the right. Okay. So, a couple lessons from Curi. And it reminded, what you were saying, Anna, kind of reminded me of some of these pieces. So often we're having really normal reactions to abnormal situations. I think in psych, something that I have sometimes an issue with is we can focus on the individual and kind of locate the problem within the individual as opposed to looking to the context that we're in and how is the external really impacting the internal. So I resonated with what you were saying, Anna, in terms of like after school, that it seems like some of that was coming up, and that makes a lot of sense. So I ended up going to PGSP. My brothers call it PGSP, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because there's so many letters in it. The first year, I really felt like I had an existential crisis. I remember waking up and asking, what the hell am I doing here? I felt really stressed. I felt disconnected from the Latino community. And I don't know that that's often really talked about within PAU, of how disconnecting it can feel. And I felt really disconnected from my ideals at SF State, where I had kind of Curi whispering in my ear about liberation psychology and theology, and about how the context impacts the individual. And I wasn't necessarily living out those ideals within school. And so I felt really disconnected. And I also was really wondering, like, can I be myself? I think sometimes in school, there was this message of be yourself, but don't be too much of yourself, because the people around you are going to be writing you letters of rec, are going to be your coworkers. So it felt confusing of how much can I own who I am. Things felt better after the third practicum. It felt like a better fit. I talked with Anna about how I was feeling. Ana Castillo, go Anna. She made me pupusas the first week of school. I love Anna. Anyway, I started therapy. That was super helpful. I also found a friend who was in the PhD program, Mona, who Dr. Munoz knows. And I was really able to connect with her about our similar experiences of being Latina within this grad school program. And finding a dissertation mentor who was Latino was really critical and huge for me. So Eduardo Bunke really held my hand throughout the process, and it just felt so nice to have a Latino mentor. So talking about dissertation chair, that's how I felt about it. I was like, ugh, which was why it was helpful to have Eduardo on my side. So to take a step back and talk about kind of what influenced my choice in terms of the subject, oftentimes when people go through an emotionally hard time, they can feel really alone in that experience. And that's a big part of why I went into psych, because I wanted to be part of someone's journey as they were kind of navigating that feeling of being alone. So since I was struggling as a student, I wanted to see if it was a common experience. And if it was, I wanted to be part of normalizing it and talking about it. So in terms of the dissertation, I created a study that aimed to look at the levels of stress in psychology doctorate students versus the general population, and look at levels of burnout and stress per year in the program, and look at rates of seeking therapy in students and the general population. So third and fourth year students grouped together reported significantly higher levels of stress and higher levels of the burnout emotional exhaustion scale than other psychology grad doctorate students. And the general population and psych students in therapy were in therapy at similar rates. So about a fourth of psych grad students reported being in therapy. About a third from the general population said they were in therapy. And just as a quick side note, when I was doing my lit review, they said that when students knew that other students were in therapy, they were more likely to seek out services for themselves. So just want to name, yeah, I was in therapy while I was in grad school, just in case that's helpful for folks to hear if there's students in here. So this was just a big reminder that we're all human and it's okay and understandable if at some point we struggle and that we all need to lean on others sometimes. And to go quickly into my next steps. So I did my internship in Texas. I went to UT Health San Antonio and worked at a couple of clinics in the San Antonio State Hospital. Then for my postdoc, I went to Weismind in the California Psychology Center, which I am at right now. And I went back to SF State to teach, which felt really cool because it felt like kind of going back to my roots. So Frederick Scudi used to teach these two classes, and then I started once he retired, Latino Community Mental Health and Latino Family Narratives. And that's me graduating, and the white head is my grandma. So I really wanna, I'm trying to put as much stuff in here as I can. I wanna pause and talk a little bit about liberation psychology, because when I was thinking, what would I have wanted to focus more in school? It would have been some of this, because we weren't talking about this. So I wanna take a second and talk about liberation psychology and this gentleman right here, who's Martín Barrow. So Martín Barrow was a psychologist in El Salvador during the Civil War, and he did a lot of research and was a big advocate for the people. And I had a little misspelling there. And he was assassinated given the research that he was doing. So he, in a speech when he came to the US, he said, you know, here it's publisher or perish, and in El Salvador it's public and perish, because there were ramifications to the advocacy work that he was doing. So just to say this really quickly, this is from the book Towards Psychologies of Liberation. Liberation psychology really emphasizes how political and economic institutions affect the individual and collective psychology. And yet again, often in psych, we often focus on individual symptomatology and the individual's history. But super important to think about how, again, is what's externally occurring, how is that impacting us and manifesting itself on an individual level. So in this book, it talks about how the very construction of the concept of a mental disorder really contributes to a serious misreading of social conditions as personal problems. So just one thought that I want to leave at least with is, how is maybe that a disservice to our patients if we're disregarding social conditions which could be manifesting as individual problems? And maybe for the faculty in the room too, of thinking, if students are struggling, how is that also maybe a reaction to the world that's around them too? So in the vein of like, what would I tell Yvette if I were to talk to her as she was starting school? Apply to more scholarships, follow your gut and trust yourself. I think a lot of times in school, I questioned myself a lot. So I would just encourage you to like, trust that inner reaction that you're having in your gut. Tap into spaces that help you feel connected to who you are and yourself, especially if there is a sense of disconnection. Contextualize your struggling. Look to why that makes sense if you are struggling. And I think that can help in terms of having compassion for ourselves. And remember that a lot of what you're learning in grad school, to be blunt, is white as fuck. And that idea of professionalism can also be steeped in that too, in that whiteness. So it's going to be hard and you might get pushback, but own who you are, stand up for what you believe in, and take things that others say, including me, with a grain of salt. And that's it.
I'd like actually to begin by following up on what Yvette just addressed. I was fortunate enough to have the pleasure to give a talk with Yvette back when she was by Pulso on La Comunidad de la Misión. ¿Te acuerdas, Yvette? And
I
you quoted something in Latin from that was on the website of Clinica and of the Clinica Martin Barrow. Do you remember that quote?
I don't. What did I say?
Primum vivere deinde philosophare, which
Hmm.
means before philosophizing about life, we must ensure life itself. And you mentioned that in your talk. That was 7 years ago, so it's been a long time. But
Damn, good
do you
memory,
remember
Dr.
that at all?
Munoz.
Yeah, so I think that's what you were talking about, right? I mean, I mean, first we need to help people live before we start philosophizing or psychologizing about stuff. And that's really important. So thank you. I just wanted to remind you of something you said some time ago.
Aw, thank you, Dr. Munoz. I really appreciate it.
I do have a question for Danielle. You mentioned that you did chemistry, you did business, then you ended up in psychology. I was gonna say, how was that transition? Did you see like, was there any overlap between what on the surface is like really diverse or in very different types of fields? And did any of that previous training help you when you changed to psychology?
Yeah. So the answer to the last question is absolutely. Like I draw on like, the logical linear thinking and the group dynamics learning and the leadership and management skills that I acquired in my prior careers in everything that I do today in psychology. And even though they do seem pretty disparate at face value, there is a journey in there, right? In engineering, like again, as I said, I was working for Procter & Gamble, selling baby diapers all over Latin America. Like our territory was from Mexico to Argentina. And developing new products is about leading organizations, right? Identifying ideas that you believe in, communicating them, and having people follow you to bring those to fruition. So getting an MBA was really a way to solidify those skills, create more legitimacy behind the things that I was doing just intuitively. And then I had a career, as I said, in management consulting, followed by tech, where I started in tech back when the internet was being invented, and ended my career in tech as a vice president at a Fortune 500 company here in the Valley. And what you do as a vice president at a Fortune 500 company here in the Valley is psychology, right? You're kind of like trying to figure out how you organize people, how do you share ideas, how you galvanize your resources. And honestly, as you get to a more senior level, it's much less about what you know content-wise and much more about what you know interpersonally. And that was the part that ended up being rewarding for me. It was like being able to mentor people one-on-one, right? Helping people kind of like grow and achieve what they wanted to achieve, or figure out what they wanted to be when they grow up inside an organization. And then I was like, why do I need to deal with like my budget, your budget, my head count, your head count, my PowerPoint, your PowerPoint? I can just really lean into this piece about how to help people grow, know themselves, and just ultimately lead like more, content lives. So that was the transition into psychology. And then as I got into psychology, my initial aim in psychology was like, oh, I'm just gonna work with like, Silicon Valley people. Those are my peeps. And, I do credit Dr. Liley to a large extent in opening up my eyes. There's a lot more people in Silicon Valley than the ones working in the tech companies with you. And then, the VA and Aki and San Jose State, and then finally landing in the public hospital in San Mateo. And it's like, I have so much love, right, for the people that I got to work with, which is so not the folks I thought I was going to be working with when I first started this journey. So, it's an evolution, and each step builds on the prior step, but you kind of don't know really where it's taking you.
I want to say thank you all for being here, to LTF and Postal for planning this, for Dr. Munoz and your incredible recall. That's wild. When Yvette, you were talking, I'm sorry, Dr. Rico, you were talking about kind of context and looking for issues in systems and environments along with people. I think Dr. Ortega-Biggs, you touched on that as well. I was reminded, as a non-psychologist, I was an English lit major and I'm the student orgs person at PAU. So I feel like I'm getting a very cool insight on 1,000 aspects of psychology, but I've also done a lot of reading so I can sort of understand what's happening in our students' academic careers. And what you were talking about reminded me of something I'd read about Dr. Carl Bell, who is a psychiatrist. So I went and pulled up the quote. He talked about, if you are a doctor and you treat somebody for a rat bite, okay, you treat them for a rat bite, then you get another patient who also has a rat bite, then you go do something about the rats. And I was wondering if you all had any thoughts to contribute kind of very broadly about what students could do, what psychologists and counselors can do for issues like that, and how advocacy shows up in your priorities and or in your daily life. Thank you.
Okay, Catherine, bring in the good questions and the quote. In terms, can I go first? Love that. And you had so many golden questions in there. I'm trying to keep track of all of them. I would just want input from the students of like, what is stressing you about like school and about your lives right now? And what can the institution and the faculty do for you? And one thing that I guess that comes to mind is, this feels kind of random, but that healing doesn't have to be in the hands of psychologists. That often people who don't have the degrees are the ones who are the most helpful. Like Anna doesn't have a degree in psychology, but she's the one that made me feel most at home and at PAU. And so I guess I just want to name that. And in terms of advocacy work, I think I feel connected to it now that I'm teaching. I felt disconnected to it for a really long time, but now that I'm discussing these things with students, it kind of feels like planting seeds and engaging with mostly Latino students like fills my heart. So I think that feels really good. And then also recognizing that that's something I want to do in the future, of maybe doing more pro bono work. So I don't know that there's one right answer, but I would just say listening, creating spaces so that the students can talk about this, and maybe integrating more of this type of thing in classes. Because I think we can get kind of lost in theory and written by white men theory, right? I mean, that's what it is. So how can we integrate stuff that isn't just theory written by white men? And how can we name it too? Like name what we're talking about right now, even with Marsha Linehan, right? This is a white woman's perspective. How does this not fit a lot of people who can go to therapy?
So if I can build on what Yvette was saying, I actually did not know that quote that you shared, Catherine. It's awesome. But I think what we can start doing in school is figuring out how we can increase access and reduce stigma. And I think that, overrides a lot of the cultural constructs of what is psychology and how do you receive it and why do you receive it. I think both Anna and I have done integrated behavioral health, which I think is one of the key entry points to increase access to mental health care right in this country. Like it can reduce stigma, it can normalize the process, it can actually meet the patient where they are. I don't know how much PAU is doing in educating people for, integrated health psychology these days, but that's something that the school can do, and the students as they chart their path can look into as well. And I think all of us have a obligation, like a moral obligation, to help reduce the stigma to mental health services. So I think this focus on increasing access and reducing stigma is something that we can all start doing even while you're in school.
Such a great question, and I have a million thoughts, which of course we don't have time for, but I think that what was sort of coming up for me was thinking about when I have had exposure to supervisors or people in power positions who were people of color, particularly who were fellow Latinos or Latinx, as I am. And I actually found that some of the most emotional abuse that I endured was actually from Latino supervisors, unfortunately. And so there's sort of that too, obviously there's a systemic thing happening there, and that is such a huge thing to address. But even in those, other than Ana Castrillo, who agrees she's incredible, she was like a mother to me when I was in school and remains very close to me all these years later. But there were other people, not at PAU, because honestly, Ana was the only Latina person that I knew at PAU when I was there. But in other internship, fellowship situations, there were just some really horrible things that I had to endure that I know others, the white students, my white colleagues, were not dealing with. So I don't have the answers for that, but as far as what I sort of do to address that, so much of my work is, in sort of healing people from, all the toxic things around racism. And I work predominantly with people of color. And have made my practice really available to serve people of color, as particularly during this pandemic, held more spots available, especially for Black women, because the need here in San Diego is so high, and there aren't barely any, psychologists of color here in San Diego. So, and that, and just a lot of political activism, right? That's where I put my other time. So I'm not answering this as eloquently as I'd like to, and I'm sure when we hang up, I'm going to think of the 70 things I wish I would have said instead, but that's just sort of what came to me. And I don't think that I necessarily answered it with anything brilliant, but just sort of more posing more questions, like why was that so commonly the experience? Why are the students of color so often having these experiences that other students in their cohort who, are not having? And I think that the other piece about finances is really important because, one of the things that I think has caused a major strain for me is that I had to take out an unbelievable amount of student loans. And a lot of that is on, PAU, because at the time, the highest scholarship or fellowship I could apply for, I got, and it was only $12,000, which is pennies compared to what we were paying. And the fact that at the time that I was there, that tuition was increased every year, those kinds of things. That has since changed, which is great. But I will never be able to pay these loans. I owe so much in interest, even though I make a mortgage payment on my loans every month. But there's just no way for me to, and that's obviously not a PAU thing. That's systemic, right? That's these student loan lenders. I made that joke in the beginning of the lecture or my presentation, but I think that all of that prevents us from then serving communities we want to serve, because I need to make money. So I can't offer as much pro bono or as much community service and things like that because I owe a yacht and then some,
Two thoughts. One of them, Carl Bell was a Black psychiatrist who worked in the Southeast Chicago. He was the CEO of a community mental health center. I had the good fortune of working with him at a National Academies prevention of mental disorders, and the comments you've made and Danielle and Yvette about psychology being part of institutions in general, of course, not just other places. and the stuff that Yvette has said about basically being conscious and active in addressing the world around us. We're having a meeting in the next hour with Dr. Our new provost, Dr. Erica Cameron, and the Latinx task force, which together we have gotten Hispanic Serving Institution designation. And one of the things that we've been talking about is that it's not just a badge, right? It has to mean something about focusing on the world around us. In this case, our world is PAU, of course, and how to create places where you don't feel like just Anna is the only one that you can go to, right? And how can we help our students not to have these massive loans and stuff? I mean, you know, now we are eligible for applying for grants and things, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing the next hour. So I think we're trying to learn from your experiences, and I really, really appreciate how honest you have been and how candid about what it was like, and we're hoping, you know, to keep on making PAU better and more welcome, not only to Latinx students, but you know, all of those students who we want to support in bringing into the field.